Watches become iconic for different reasons, but interestingly enough, it's rarely about innovation. Some of the most important watches, technically speaking, are somewhat forgotten. If you asked watch enthusiasts to name Seiko's most iconic or greatest watches, few would name the Astron, but it's probably the most important watch ever, period. No, they would talk about the SKX and the Turtle and the 62 Moss and Sarb and Marine Master. Rolex's most iconic watches, from the Submariner to the Daytona to the Explorer, Omega's Speedmaster, these watches have a kind of status mostly as the product of great marketing. And that's okay, that's just the nature of this industry. Often it's the people who choose to wear certain watches, from Steve McQueen rocking the Hanhart 417 or Tag Heuer Monaco to Paul Newman's Daytona. But sometimes a watch comes along that's just so perfectly timed and perfectly executed, packaged in a certain way, and just nailing the fundamentals so well that people just keep buying it. That's the case with the watch we're looking at today, the legendary Casio Duro. Now, I think I know you guys. If you're watching this Casio video and you're anything like me, you're always down to get a watch for cheap. I've officially launched my own Joma Shop affiliate page that you guys can check out by clicking the link in the description below. You can peruse some of my favorite watches of all different price points, or you can just look around the site. They have pretty much everything. Whether you're hunting for a budget Casio or a mid-tier Seiko, or you just want to see what kind of trouble you can get yourself into, hit the link and poke around. You might find your next daily wearer at a price that you just can't resist. All right, enough of that. Let's jump back into the video. The turn of the most recent century was an interesting time for watchmakers. The Swiss had clawed their way back to relevance as luxury mechanical watches were finally selling well again. Seiko and Casio and Timex, of course, dominated the affordable watch segment, but Casio spent much of the 2000s rapidly growing its business into new markets, things like digital cameras and instruments, and even early smart devices like the Cassiopeia. On the watch side, the G-Shock had grown into a full-on lifestyle brand. They'd made their iconic affordable models more available than ever, and Casio was still innovating. Watches like the Wave Scepter, for example, pushed radio sync technology really into the mainstream. But it had been a bit since Casio had released an all-new, industry-altering watch, and so as the 2010s rolled around, it was time for something new, but something very different from the watches that Casio had been known for. At this time, affordable dive watch was almost synonymous with Seiko. The entire entry-level dive watch landscape was dominated by Seiko. The SKX era was at its peak, with the 007 and 009 selling literally in droves, and even the smaller little brother Submariner homages selling in certain markets. Micro brands hadn't blown up yet at this point, and so Casio had an in. What if they could make a dive watch that had everything? A stylish, classic design, that timeless dive watch silhouette, stainless steel, incredibly legible, professional level specs, but above all else, make it available in an ultra affordable package. Now, this wouldn't be Casio's first dive watch. Before the Duro ever existed, Casio already had a surprisingly deep history with dive-oriented watches, just not typically in this classic analog form. In the 1980s, Casio created a lineup of digital divers known collectively as the Marlin watches, named for their small Marlin logo printed on the dials. These were early water-resistant digital tool watches built for swimming, snorkeling, and also in many cases full professional diving. These were true digital dive watches. They had depth meters, dive timers, log functions, and full 200-meter water resistance, long before most affordable brands were doing anything comparable. The Marlin series earned a cult following for giving everyday buyers a reliable, rugged dive companion at a time when this category was still dominated by far more expensive mechanical brands. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, Casio kept the Marlin logo alive across multiple various water sports models, sometimes digital, sometimes analog, like the lesser-known MD709, but never in a package that was universally appealing. Despite its new form, it was time to put that Marlin logo on a new kind of watch. Now, the watch in question's release would come in the year 2011 under the model name MDV-106, or as it's more well known, the Duro. When Casio released the MDV-106, it wasn't presented as this major product launch or some sort of groundbreaking innovation. or even as part of a big marketing campaign. In typical Casio fashion, it just kind of showed up quietly. But this unassuming diver would go on to become one of the most recognizable, affordable tool watches of its era, and one of the most successful mechanical style analog watches that Casio ever produced. Casio had made plenty of dive watches, but never quite like this, at least not in this form. The rather large 44mm case in stainless steel was perhaps the standout feature. This didn't look like a Casio, and it sure didn't feel or look like a $50 watch. Brushed lugs, polished case sides, a classic round profile with really no embellishments or anything crazy, 200 meters of water resistance with a screw-down crown and caseback. Solid, reliable, but just deliberately simple. On top of this, the watch featured a unidirectional 120-click bezel made in aluminum with large timing hashes, a clear high-contrast pip at 12, chunky teeth for easy grip, and a nice, satisfying, dare I say luxurious, clicky bezel. A gloss black dial with large white indices filled with lume, sword-style hands, and a framed date window at 3, and that Marlin logo at 6, a detail that would become beloved, but actually would disappear from certain Duro models later. The dial is all about simplicity and legibility. It's the same design logic found on ISO divers, even though the Duro itself was not ISO certified. Now, it was of course a budget watch. You can't make a $50 watch have everything, so it had a mineral crystal, which is inexpensive but durable enough for daily wear, an accurate but cheap Casio quartz movement, though in many ways this is the heart of the Duro's appeal. It's got that quartz simplicity and toughness but analog looks. Originally sold on a simple black resin strap, though also on a bracelet today, but for many the real fun is going aftermarket when it comes to straps. Casio intentionally kept the strap basic to keep costs down, and all of this with a launch price of $50. It was too good to resist for watch collectors of really all kinds, including this guy, Bill Gates, who actually helped popularize the Duro by wearing it all the time. At this time, a true budget watch that was in this $50 range, well, they weren't typically like the Duro. You could get something like a World Timer from Casio or a Timex Easy Reader, and other than that, it was mostly gas station watches in this price point. Just garbage, really. Disposable, flimsy fashion pieces, chrome-plated cases, hollow-feeling buttons, rattly bezels, if anything in this price point even had a bezel, and water resistance ratings that just were not reliable. Cheap watches at this time did work for telling the time and not much else, and they certainly weren't built to last. What you absolutely could not get for $50 was a real diver style watch. Stainless steel, screw down crown, 200 meters of water resistance, a proper rotating bezel, legibility, and style that rivaled watches literally 100 times the price. The Duro wasn't just another affordable watch, it was something unheard of in this bracket. And that's exactly why it became so popular and so legendary. I also think it's fair to say that the rise of the go anywhere, do anything watch, and also just the beater watch in general, helped to make the Duro a hit. For much of watch history, your watch was just your watch. If you had the money and desire to buy something special and even expensive, that was just your watch. And if you decided to go fly a plane or work on a car, that was still the watch you wore, and you just fixed it if you broke it. There wasn't really this concept of owning really nice luxury watches and then also having significantly cheaper versions of said watch, if that makes sense. There wasn't the Moon Swatch for Speedmaster owners, or loads of Submariner and Explorer homages for Rolex people. I'm not saying it wasn't a thing at all, it just wasn't like it is today. And by the time the Duro came around, it was able to function for many as a kind of beater Submariner or 50 Fathoms for people who, didn't want to ruin those watches or just couldn't afford those watches. It was a true Gado watch. And also in many ways, the Duro was a fusion of a few different ideals that were already present at Casio. It really brought together the more professional, luxury aesthetic of, say, the Edifice collection with the tool nature of their digital watches. And the idea to do this for a dive watch was just so brilliant from Casio, as the dive watch does sit as kind of the ultimate fusion of luxury and tool. Casio has now sold millions of these watches, and they can be had for a little more than their original price tag. It's also worth noting that the Duro really became the ultimate dive watch for many actual divers, like professional divers. Similar to professional anything, whether it's rock climbing or hunting, it's demanding and often hard on gear. Using a luxury dive watch for diving was already at this point a somewhat ridiculous idea, but the options for those wanting a nice, classic looking but affordable and accurate, durable dive watch was limited. Like we said, Seiko was really the go-to option for many, but not in this $50 price bracket. A Seiko Tuna Professional or Citizen ProMaster Aqualand would run you more like $300-400. And sure, you'd be getting more watch, but for $50, this thing was just a steal, and so professional divers bought it and used it. It was tough, it was reliable, legible, water-ready, and cheap enough that if you smashed it on something like, coral, whatever divers break their watches on, gear probably, or say you just lost it, you just bought another one. To many divers, it wasn't a fashion watch. It was just simply the most practical tool for the job, for the cheapest amount. The popularity of the original Duro meant that Casio would eventually turn it into a kind of line or series rather than just a one-off watch. The core MDV 106 stayed the same big 44mm, 200-meter, screw-down crown, kind of internet's favorite $50 diver, but Casio quietly spun it into a mini line of colorways: black bezel, blue bezel, green bezel, Batman, Pepsi, even a gold tone bezel version, all sharing the same basic case and layout. Later, under the MDV 107 designation, they refreshed the watch again with new colors and small tweaks, most notably losing the little fish logo on the dial while keeping the same fundamental specs of this watch. But the weirdest and perhaps most controversial evolution was the so-called mini Duro, the MDV 10. On paper, Casio finally did what everybody had been begging for, a smaller Duro, because it is such a big watch, listed at around 38 to 39 millimeters, and aimed at people who thought that the original wore a little bit big. In practice, though, reviewers who got their hands on one of these found that it actually measures closer to 36 millimeters across the case, with a lug-to-lug of around 41.7 millimeters, and crucially, a tiny 16 millimeter lug width. That 16 millimeter bracelet tapers down to just 14 millimeters at the clasp, which multiple reviewers have called cartoonishly small for what's supposed to be still a men's dive watch, but it's more like a kid's watch really, and it makes aftermarket strap options a pain, which really misses the whole point of the Duro. On top of that, the MDV 10 drops to 50 meters of water resistance, swaps the screw-down caseback and crown for a snapback and regular crown, and uses a lighter 60-click bezel, all of which makes it feel less like, a smaller version of the original Colt, tool diver that the Duro is, and more like just a cheap, crappy watch. Now, because Casio priced this watch so low, it ended up becoming one of the most heavily modded watches in the community. This watch is everywhere on Instagram and on social media, and it really is a huge part of modding culture. One of the most common upgrades, of course, is the crystal. Companies like Long Island Watch sell drop-in flat sapphire replacements specifically for the Duro with AR coating, helping this watch kind of become just a more serious tool watch. But then it also gets pretty wild. There are aftermarket bezel inserts all over Amazon and eBay, including ceramic and different colorways. There are YouTube tutorials walking through how to swap these things, and it really is a perfect platform for creativity. Now, I wanted to get my hands on this watch, so I jumped on Amazon and I picked up a nice Pepsi version on a steel bracelet for about $70. Not too bad. It arrived literally the next day, and I've got to say, this is a strange experience for a Casio guy. I've had a few Casios, and this is just a different kind of watch from what I'm used to from Casio. It has that luxury heft, not something you associate with Casio. Of course, at this price point, you don't get any sort of luxury unboxing experience, which I wouldn't expect that. But aside from that, this dive watch, it really is everything people say. Honestly, the only thing I don't love is the size. 44 millimeters is just too big for most wrists and bigger than my liking. I have a 7.5-inch wrist, and I can wear it, sure. And maybe if I was actually diving, this is the kind of watch that I would want. You don't really want a tiny little dive watch. A big part of visibility comes down to size, really. And the visibility is great on this, but as someone who wants to wear a dive watch more as just an everyday piece, I would struggle to pick this over a 40 millimeter dive watch. That would be fantastic. If this watch was about 40 millimeters, it would be perfect. Still, it is really quality feeling, and I do think that developing and producing watches like the Duro really did help Casio prepare to make their more premium edifice mechanical watches that they're making now. But, that's another story for another video. I would love to hear from you guys. What do you guys think of the Duro? Do you think it's one of Casio's greatest watches? Maybe you've owned one. Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you guys in the next video.